Power is built on control. Control over business, over people, over outcomes. The moment you lose control, you lose everything. My name is Richard Brown. I'm 62 years old, and I built my empire from the ground up. Nothing was handed to me. Nothing was easy. I clawed my way out of a childhood where bills piled up faster than my old man's drinking debts. Now, Brown Industries moves freight across the country, making sure businesses get what they need on time, every time. My name means something in this town. I don't waste time with small talk, but people talk to me anyway. At the club, in the office, at the restaurants where the real deals happen. It was a comment at the Corinthian, a steakhouse where I've closed more contracts than I can count, that planted the first seed of doubt in my mind. Thought I saw you in Austin last week. Tom Sanchez, one of my associates, said over his bourbon. At that new gallery on 6th. Or maybe it was your wife. Tall blonde, looked like her. Phoebe doesn't like Austin. Too young and hipster, she says. If she was there, it wasn't for the city. I didn't react. That's the thing about power. Your first move has to be measured. I cut into my steak and kept the conversation moving. Inside, though, I was already lining up the questions. The next day, I had a routine checkup at Dr. McDonald's office. The man's been my doctor for years, solid, doesn't waste words. As he checked my blood pressure, he mentioned something offhand. Phoebe's been in a few times lately, he said, scribbling notes. Seemed a little stressed, but she's healthy. Stress? Over what? Our life was set. No financial worries, no hard work. She had freedom, security, a home most people only see in magazines. I nodded, nothing more. That evening, I had Dallas Pearson meet me at my office. Retired FBI, now a consultant, Dallas knows how to dig without leaving a trace. Want me to look into it? He asked, flipping through a small notebook. I shook my head. I'll handle it. Some men rush to anger when they suspect betrayal. They yell, throw things, beg. Weakness. Power isn't about reacting, it's about knowing. Phoebe wasn't careful. A quick glance at our financials showed odd charges. Hotels. Restaurants I'd never been to. One name stood out, Riley Stevens. An artist. I didn't laugh, but I almost did. A quick search pulled up his face, mid-40s, unshaven, all paint-stained hands and brooding eyes. Exactly the kind of man a bored housewife convinces herself is deep. I let it sit for a day, gave Phoebe the chance to say something, a window to be honest. But that's the thing about people who cheat. They don't confess. They lie, even when the truth is obvious. So I drove to Austin. Riley's studio was in a converted warehouse, the kind of place that tried to look edgy but was still owned by an investment group. I parked across the street and waited. An hour later, Phoebe arrived, laughing as she climbed the stairs, wearing a dress I paid for. I gave it 10 minutes, then walked to the door and knocked. It took a while before Riley answered. He looked me up and down, paint smudged on his shirt, his eyes narrowing slightly, like he was trying to figure out if I was a buyer. Can I help you? He asked. I'm Richard Brown, I said, stepping forward just enough to make him shift back. Phoebe's husband. He froze. Not the reaction of a man who thought he was doing the right thing. Behind him, Phoebe's voice came from inside, light, careless. Who is it, babe? Babe. Riley swallowed, opening his mouth, but I stepped past him into the studio. Phoebe stood near a half-finished painting, glass of wine in her hand. Her face drained of color when she saw me. She covered it fast, setting the glass down, straightening her shoulders. What are you doing here? I glanced around the room. Messy, full of unfinished ideas, just like the man himself. I met Riley's eyes. Nice setup. Richard, Phoebe started, stepping forward like she could control the conversation. I held up a hand, and she stopped. Then I turned to Riley. Do you know who I am? His throat bobbed. Yeah. Good. I let the silence sit. He shifted under it. Weak men can't handle silence. Phoebe crossed her arms. You're making a scene. No. I'm giving you both a moment to think about your choices. I adjusted my cufflinks. Because from this point forward, things are going to change. Riley finally found his voice. Look, I turned my head slightly. He stopped talking. I took my time looking around the studio again. Do you know how many art galleries in this state rely on Brown Industries for transport? I asked. How many of your little collectors shake hands with me at fundraisers? Riley's face twitched. I smiled. You will. Then I turned to Phoebe. She looked angry now, which meant she was scared. You'll be home tonight, I told her. Pack a bag. We're done. I didn't wait for a response. Just walked out. In business, the strongest man in the room is the one who leaves last. In war, it's the one who leaves first, because it means the fight is already won. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was in control. And now? They were about to find out what happens when you cross a man like me. I drove back to Houston with a clear mind. Some men would be sitting in a bar, nursing a drink, asking themselves where they went wrong. I wasn't interested in self-pity. I built everything I had by thinking ahead, by controlling the board while everyone else focused on a single move. Phoebe and her paint-stained boy had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. That night, she came home just like I told her to. I was in my office, reviewing quarterly reports, when I heard the front door close. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, hesitant, uncertain. I let her come to me. She stopped in the doorway, arms crossed over her stomach, a small suitcase at her feet. You don't want to talk about this? I kept my eyes on the numbers in front of me. We did, earlier. Rick. I set the papers down, met her gaze. What's there to discuss? You wanted excitement. You got it. I told you to pack a bag, and here you are. I gestured at the suitcase. It's a rare thing, someone actually listening to me these days. She bristled, stepping further into the room. I never meant for it to be. Spare me. I leaned back in my chair. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know how these things start? First, it's harmless. Just talking. A little attention. A little thrill. Then, suddenly, you're in some second-rate studio drinking cheap wine and pretending you're in a goddamn romance novel. I shook my head. And now you're standing here, expecting what? A fight? A plea to work things out? Her jaw tightened. I expected something. I watched her for a moment, then exhaled. Phoebe, let me explain something to you. I don't fight battles that aren't worth winning. She looked away, staring at the bookshelves. So, that's it. 17 years, and you're just... 17 years, I repeated. 17 years of making sure you never wanted for anything. Of building a life where you could do whatever you wanted, go wherever you wanted, be whoever you wanted. And what did you do with all of that freedom? You threw it away for a guy who probably doesn't even own a suit. Her mouth opened, then closed. You knew who I was when you married me, I continued, my voice even. You knew what kind of life you were walking into. You weren't a prisoner, Phoebe. You just didn't like the reality of the choices you made. That's not my problem. She was silent for a long moment, then let out a short laugh, shaking her head. Jesus, you really don't feel anything, do you? I stood, moving around the desk until I was right in front of her. What do you want me to feel? Sad? Betrayed? Phoebe, I win. That's what I do. And right now, you're not a part of that anymore. She swallowed hard, blinking fast. So what now? Lawyers. Already handled. Her breath caught. What? I stepped back, leaning against my desk. Prenup was airtight. You leave with what you brought in. Which, as you might recall, wasn't much. Her face paled. You're not serious. Dead serious. I gestured toward the door. You might want to start figuring out where you're staying tonight. She stared at me, searching for something in my expression that wasn't there. Then, with a sharp breath, she grabbed her suitcase and walked out. I waited until I heard the front door shut before I picked up my phone and called Dallas. He answered on the second ring. It's done, I said. Dallas let out a low chuckle. Didn't expect anything less. Want me to keep an eye on her? No need. I reached for my whiskey glass, rolling the liquid inside. She's not my problem anymore. Dallas exhaled. And the other guy? I took a sip, letting the burn settle. Oh, I'm not done with him yet. The next morning, I was at my desk by 6. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the office was quiet except for the hum of the espresso machine in the corner. Routine kept things moving, kept the mind sharp. Phoebe's absence didn't change anything. The house felt the same. My schedule remained. The only difference was the slight inconvenience of a legal formality, one I had already set in motion. By 8, my attorney, Luke Ross, was sitting across from me, flipping through a folder thick with paperwork. He was the kind of man who never wasted words, which was why I paid him more than I should. She doesn't have a case, he said, glancing up. Prenup is clear. No assets, no alimony, no drawn-out negotiations. I nodded, skimming through the documents myself. She's not the problem. Luke tilted his head. The artist. I tapped a page. Riley Stevens. What do we know? He closed the folder, lacing his fingers together. Typical story. Struggling artist. Lives off wealthy women's generosity. Flaky, inconsistent. No real income. Just a reputation for being passionate. Which means broke. I smirked. Then why does he have money? Luke hesitated. Go on. Phoebe had no access to my accounts, which means she wasn't funding him. But someone was. I slid a separate set of documents across the desk. Dallas pulled his financials. The guy's been moving money around, selling pieces well above market value, getting direct deposits from names that don't match any real collectors. It's not just rich women buying his nonsense. There's something else going on. Luke skimmed the reports, his expression sharpening. Art laundering. That's what I'm thinking. He exhaled, nodding. You want me to dig? I leaned back in my chair. No. I want you to pull the right strings. Quietly, Luke closed the folder and stood. Consider it handled. By lunchtime, things were already shifting. A call from one of my contacts at the city's largest gallery confirmed that Riley was suddenly finding himself disinvited from future exhibits. Word spreads fast when the right people talk. By the end of the day, a few of his pieces were mysteriously pulled from collectors' walls. Turns out, people don't like realizing they overpaid for trash. I was wrapping up at the office when Dallas called. You're gonna love this. I put him on speaker, pouring myself a drink. Go on. Your boy's panicking. There was amusement in Dallas's voice. He tried to pull money from an account, but it's been frozen. Someone flagged his transactions. I took a sip. That was fast. You know how it works. One whisper in the right ear, and suddenly a lot of people are interested in where his money's coming from. Good. I leaned against the desk. And Phoebe, she's staying in a hotel. Nothing fancy. Probably thought she had more of a cushion. I smirked. Reality's a hell of a thing. Dallas chuckled. What's next? I swirled the whiskey in my glass. Let's see how long it takes before he cracks. By the end of the week, Riley was unraveling. The kind of guy who thrived on whispers of admiration and flattery suddenly found himself surrounded by silence. His buyers weren't returning calls, his usual wealthy patrons weren't answering emails, and his name was quietly being erased from gallery schedules. The art world was fickle. One bad rumor, one suspicious financial hiccup, and suddenly no one wanted to be associated with you. I had lunch at the Barrington Club, a private steakhouse downtown, with Oliver Morrison, a longtime business acquaintance who sat on the board of one of the city's biggest cultural foundations. We didn't talk about Riley directly. There was no need. But over a medium-rare ribeye and a glass of bourbon, Oliver mentioned that their upcoming gala had some last-minute changes. A couple of artists had their invitations rescinded, he said, slicing into his steak. Turns out, some of their work wasn't exactly legitimate. I took a sip of my drink. Unfortunate. Oliver nodded. Happens. By the time I was back at the office, a text from Dallas was waiting. He's trying to pull cash again. No luck. Want to take a ride? I had nothing else on my calendar that couldn't wait. I grabbed my coat and headed downstairs, where Dallas was waiting in his truck. We drove across town to a low-rent strip of studios on the east side. The kind of place where artists who couldn't afford downtown rent ended up, hoping for a break that never came. Riley's loft was at the top of a set of rusted-out stairs. Dallas parked, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He's in there. Been pacing since this morning. I stepped out, climbed the stairs, and knocked. No answer. Knocked again, harder. This time, movement. A few seconds later, the door cracked open, and Riley's bloodshot eyes appeared. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I smiled. You've got a minute. His gaze darted behind me, as if expecting someone else. What do you want? I pushed the door open and walked in. The place was a mess. Half-finished canvases, empty coffee cups, and an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. Phoebe always hated cigarettes. Guess she made exceptions for artists. Riley rubbed his face, exhaling. Look, man. I cut him off. How's business? His eyes snapped to mine, something flickering behind them. You did this. I tilted my head. Did what? You. He gestured wildly at the space around him. The sales, the galleries, the money. I don't know who you paid off, but you. I took a slow step toward him. I didn't pay anyone. I just let the right people know they might want to take a closer look at how you operate. Riley swallowed hard. You can't just. I laughed, shaking my head. Of course I can. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he wasn't stupid enough to make a move. He wasn't a fighter. He was a leech who relied on smooth words and soft touches to get what he wanted. I let the silence stretch, watching him sweat. Then I leaned in slightly. You made a mistake, I said, my voice even. You thought this was just about Phoebe. about some affair. But it's not. It's about respect. And you? You disrespected the wrong man. Riley's jaw twitched. So what now? You've taken my income, my reputation. What else do you want? I smiled. Nothing. I already have everything I want. I turned toward the door, then glanced back. But if I were you, I'd start thinking about my next career move. Because you're done here. I walked out, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own choices. Dallas smirked as I climbed back into the truck. Well, I fastened my seatbelt. He knows. Dallas nodded. You think he'll run? I checked my watch. Doesn't matter. 2 weeks later, Riley was gone. Packed up whatever scraps he had left and disappeared, probably to some second-rate city where his name still held weight with people too naive to ask questions. He hadn't tried to contact Phoebe, at least not that I knew of. He was too busy scrambling to stay ahead of the mess I dropped in his lap. Phoebe, on the other hand, was still in town, still clinging to whatever dignity she had left. She wasn't stupid. She knew she had no legal ground to stand on, and she hadn't tried to fight the divorce in court. Instead, she tried to act like she wasn't drowning. I heard from mutual acquaintances that she was making the rounds at a few social gatherings, keeping up appearances, trying to pretend she wasn't living out of a mid-range hotel instead of our estate. I wasn't interested in where she ended up. She made her choice. I was more focused on the future. Abel and I hadn't spoken much during the fall, but he was back in town for a board meeting at Brown Industries. He'd been running our West Coast operations for the past few years, and while he had the same sharp mind for business, there had always been a distance between us. Maybe because he'd never had to scrape and fight the way I had. Maybe because he'd always felt like he had something to prove. We sat across from each other in my office, the afternoon light cutting through the blinds, the city skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He glanced at the divorce papers stacked on my desk. It's official? I nodded. Signed and filed. He leaned back, exhaling. Can't say I'm surprised. She was never built for this life. I studied him. You never liked her. He shrugged. I didn't dislike her. I just didn't respect her. He paused. Neither did you. I raised a brow. I married her. You married the version of her that existed when she met you. She married power. When it stopped exciting her, she looked somewhere else. I leaned back in my chair, considering that. Abel had always been direct, something I appreciated, even if I didn't always like what he had to say. What's next for you? He asked. I gestured toward the files on my desk. Expanding operations. There's an opportunity to buy out a smaller competitor. If it goes through, we'll increase our international reach by 20%. Abel smirked. Nothing like a divorce to clear the schedule. I smirked back. Nothing like betrayal to sharpen the focus. He nodded, then glanced at me, something unreadable in his expression. You should come out to LA sometime. See what we're building over there. That was as close to an invitation as I was going to get. I nodded. Maybe I will. He stood, straightening his tie. I've got dinner with a few investors. I'll see you tomorrow. As he left, I looked out at the city, the lights beginning to flicker on as the sun dipped below the buildings. Phoebe was a mistake. But mistakes didn't define men like me. What we built, what we left behind, that was what mattered. And I wasn't done building yet. The morning after the board meeting, I was at the club before sunrise, the scent of fresh coffee and cigar smoke hanging in the air. The usual crowd was filtering in bankers, developers, men who had made their way to the top and knew how to stay there. I had a meeting with Faith West, an old acquaintance who had built a hotel empire with the same relentlessness I had built Brown Industries. She was already seated when I arrived, skimming through the business section of the paper. She glanced up as I sat down, setting the paper aside. So, the rumors are true. I signaled for coffee. Which ones? She smirked. The ones about your wife. Or rather, ex-wife. I poured cream into my coffee, stirring slowly. They're true. She studied me for a moment, her sharp blue eyes calculating. And how are you handling it? I took a sip. Like any other bad investment, cut losses and move forward. Faith chuckled. Efficient. She leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. I'd say I'm surprised, but I'm not. I always wondered why you married someone like her. I raised a brow. And what kind of woman is that? The kind who wants power without understanding the price of it. She tilted her head. You don't respect weakness, Rick. Never have. I didn't argue. The waiter brought her another cup of tea, and she stirred it absent-mindedly. I assume you're not just here for socializing. I set my cup down. I'm acquiring Brightwell Freight. They've got roots in South America I need. She nodded, clearly already aware of the company. Smart move. I need lodging contracts in the region. Your properties are already established there. She smiled. And you'd rather work with someone you trust. Someone who understands the game, I corrected. Faith sipped her tea, then set it down with a decisive click. I'll have my team send over the details. I nodded. Good. She smirked. And here I thought we were going to talk about your personal life. I smiled slightly. Business first. She chuckled. Always. By the time I left the club, the deal was already set in motion. Business had always been the constant, the thing that never lied, never wavered. You put in the work, you made the right moves, and you won. Everything else, marriages, emotions, people who thought they could take something from you, they were just distractions. That afternoon, I got a text from Dallas. You're going to want to see this. I called him. Talk. He let out a low chuckle. Phoebe's at the green room. I glanced at my watch. A bar in the middle of the afternoon. And she's been trying to cozy up to a guy who doesn't look too interested. A lawyer, from what I can tell. I smirked. Already looking for her next meal ticket. Looks like it. I shook my head, unimpressed, but not surprised. Let her try. Dallas exhaled. You ever wonder if she regrets it? I considered that for a moment. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Either way, it wasn't my problem. No, I said. She made her bed. I hung up, grabbed my briefcase, and walked into my next meeting. There was work to be done. A year later, I stood in the main lobby of Brown Global Logistics, shaking hands with investors as cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes. The new headquarters was a 40-story tower in downtown Houston, a symbol of everything I'd built. The press was calling it the next step in my company's expansion, a testament to legacy and power. They weren't wrong. Abel stood beside me, sharp in his tailored suit, answering questions from the financial analyst with the same confidence I used to have at his age. He had proven himself in the last year, took over key negotiations, closed deals I let him handle. The board respected him, and more importantly, so did I. Faith was there too, nodding approvingly as she scanned the crowd. Our partnership had turned into something more efficient, practical. We were cut from the same cloth. We had dinner when it suited us, traveled together when it made sense, but neither of us needed anything from the other. No illusions, no wasted time. As I finished another handshake, Dallas stepped up, slipping a folded paper into my hand. Thought you'd like an update. I unfolded it. A police report. Riley Stevens, arrested in Miami for fraud, wire transfers, and tax evasion. Someone had finally connected the dots between his fake art sales and offshore accounts. He was looking at 5 to 10 years, minimum. I smiled. Took longer than I expected. Dallas smirked. Turns out, people get sloppy when they're desperate. I tucked the paper into my jacket. It wasn't satisfaction. I'd been done with him long ago, but there was something about knowing he'd ended up exactly where he belonged. Phoebe had disappeared from the city's social circles. Last I heard, she had moved back to her sister's place in Dallas, still hoping to land on her feet. The lawyer she'd been cozying up to had dropped her within a month. Turns out, men who work for their money don't like women who waste it. I never heard from her again. The event wrapped up as the sun set over the skyline. Investors filtered out, employees celebrated, the press got their quotes. I walked through the lobby, past the massive Brown Industries insignia mounted behind the front desk. Abel caught up to me as I stepped outside. Big night. I nodded. You did well. He adjusted his tie, looking out at the city. I was thinking about taking a trip to South America next quarter, meeting some of the partners in person. I looked at him, measuring the weight of his words. He was taking ownership. Good. Do it. He nodded. You coming? I smirked. You can handle it. He smiled slightly, then gave me a firm handshake. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Just a man who knew what he was doing. As he walked off, I pulled out a cigar, cutting the end as Dallas walked up beside me. So, Dallas said, lighting his own, what now? I took a slow drag, exhaled the smoke into the night air, and watched as the city stretched before me, still mine. Whatever the hell I want.